We heard you scooped up that fancy cabin in Aspen. We are moving in to bury the hatchet, my daughter-in-law barked, shoving her designer bags through my heavy timber door, like she owned the place. I just smirked, stepping aside to let them barge right in. But the second they stepped into the great room, their arrogant faces drained of all color. I am Cliff, 67 years old, and I spent my entire life building an empire from the ground up. Before I tell you exactly what was waiting for them inside that room, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to watch the people you love show their true greedy colors and then had to teach them a lesson they would never forget. The sharp, jagged sound of tearing paper echoed off the peeling wallpaper of my cramped kitchen. Morgan, my son, Cameron's wife, did not even bother taking off her oversized sunglasses as she ripped open the envelope containing my monthly Social Security check. She pulled the paper out, her manicured nails tapping against the cheap linoleum counter. She shoved a pen toward my chest, not looking me in the eye. "Endorse it." "Cliff," she demanded, her voice carrying that familiar piercing tone of absolute entitlement. "Cameron's landscaping bill for the estate is due tomorrow, and you owe us for bringing you those leftover groceries on Sunday. You need to pull your weight." I stared at the cheap plastic pen she was forcing into my hand, then at the woman who had systematically dismantled my son's spine over the last 6 years. I remained completely silent. My silence always agitated her. She leaned in, the cloying scent of her expensive floral perfume suffocating the stale air of the small kitchen. "Do not look at me like that." She snapped, her upper lip curling into a sneer. "You went bankrupt paying for Diane's hospital bills. We all know it. There is no shame in being broke, Cliff, but Cameron has been subsidizing your existence ever since your wife died 2 years ago. The least you can do is contribute to your grandson's lifestyle maintenance. If you cannot do that, I honestly do not see why Leo should be visiting a grandfather who lives in a rat trap. It is not a healthy environment for a 5-year-old boy." The threat hung in the air, heavy and deliberate. Withhold the check, lose the grandson. That was the currency they traded in now. It was not an empty threat. 3 months ago, when I refused to co-sign a loan for her new luxury SUV, they conveniently forgot to bring Leo over for 4 consecutive weekends, claiming he was simply too busy with private tutoring. I looked down at the endorsement line on the back of the check. It was a meager sum, barely enough to cover basic groceries for a month. But to Morgan, it was just another drop in the bucket of her relentless consumption. Without a single word, I took the pen, signed my name, and slid the paper across the counter. Morgan snatched it up with a triumphant scoff. "Thank you for finally being reasonable," she muttered aggressively, stuffing the endorsed check into her oversized leather handbag. "We will drop Leo off next month if Cameron's schedule clears up. Try to clean this place up before then. It smells like despair." She turned on her heel and marched out the front door, slamming it so hard the flimsy window pane rattled in its frame. I did not move. I just watched the dust settle in the quiet apartment. As I stepped forward to lock the deadbolt, my foot brushed against something on the floor. It was a crumpled piece of heavy cardstock dropped from Morgan's overstuffed bag in her haste to leave. I picked it up and smoothed out the creases. It was a formal notice from a major national bank. The bold red letters at the top spelled out "Final Foreclosure Warning." It detailed 3 months of missed mortgage payments on Cameron and Morgan's sprawling luxury estate, threatening immediate seizure of the property if the outstanding balance of $80,000 was not wired within 10 days. I stared at the terrifying numbers. The financial facade they projected to the world was cracking, completely hollowed out by their own arrogance. They were drowning in debt, and instead of cutting back, Morgan was extorting my meager government checks just to keep up appearances. The utter desperation of it all should have made me feel pity for my son. Instead, it only solidified the cold, hard resolve building in my chest. 2 days later, the situation escalated from bleak to completely untenable. I was standing in the hallway when my landlord, a ruthless man who cared only for margins, marched up to my door alongside a city inspector. The inspector pointed a flashlight at the thick black mold creeping up the drywall from the leaking plumbing of the upstairs unit. The landlord did not offer an apology. He simply slapped an official bright yellow eviction notice directly onto my chest. "The building is officially condemned, Cliff," he said, without an ounce of empathy. "You have until midnight to pack your bags and vacate the premises. The city is shutting off the power and water in 2 hours. Do not make me call the police to drag you out." I looked at the notice, then at the black mold destroying the ceiling. I had paid my rent on time every single month, but there was no arguing with a city condemnation order. The reality was absolute. I was being thrown onto the street. I packed my few visible belongings into a single duffel bag, walked out to my rusted beat-up pickup truck, and threw the bag into the passenger seat. The sky broke open, unleashing a torrential, freezing downpour as I drove across town. The windshield wipers barely kept up with the rain as I navigated the winding, manicured roads leading up to Cameron's exclusive gated community. I pulled up to the massive iron gates, buzzed myself in using the family code, and drove up the long, sweeping driveway of the estate they were currently failing to pay for. I parked my rusted truck behind Morgan's gleaming leased SUV and walked up to the heavy oak double doors. The freezing rain soaked through my thin jacket as I rang the bell. It took a full 2 minutes before the door creaked open. Cameron stood there in a silk bathrobe holding a glass of wine. He looked at my dripping clothes, then at the duffel bag slung over my shoulder, and his face instantly hardened with panic. "Dad, what are you doing here?" he hissed, glancing nervously over his shoulder into the foyer. "The city condemned my building, Cameron," I said, my voice steady despite the freezing rain running down my face. "Black mold in the walls. They gave me 2 hours to get out. I just need to stay in the empty guest house out back for 1 week. Just 7 days until I can secure another lease." Cameron shifted uncomfortably, his eyes darting to the floor. "Dad, you cannot stay here. We are hosting a charity gala this weekend. The guest house is being used for the caterers to prep the seafood stations. I cannot have you living out there." Before I could respond, Morgan appeared behind him, holding a crystal glass of champagne. She looked me up and down, her expression twisting into utter disgust. "You have got to be kidding me," she laughed, a harsh grating sound that cut right through the noise of the storm. "You show up here looking like a vagrant and expect us to house you. We have a reputation to maintain in this neighborhood, Cliff. Having your rusted truck parked in our driveway is humiliating enough." "Morgan, I am not asking to sleep in your living room," I said, keeping my voice dangerously level. "I am asking my son for a roof over my head for a few nights, so I do not have to sleep in my truck in a freezing storm." Cameron opened his mouth, but Morgan cut him off immediately. "Find a homeless shelter that takes pensioners." "Cliff," she spat, her eyes flashing with pure malice. "We are not running a charity for bad financial planning. You went broke. That is your fault. Do not bring your failures to our doorstep." She grabbed the heavy brass handle of the oak door. "And do not come back unless you are invited." She slammed the door violently in my face. The heavy thud echoed in my chest. I stood on the pristine limestone porch for a long moment, the freezing rain pounding against my shoulders. I did not cry. I did not beg. I did not bang my fists against the wood. I simply turned around and walked slowly back to my truck. I climbed inside the damp, cold cabin and shut the door. The sound of the storm was muffled, leaving only the sound of my own steady breathing. I reached deep into the lining of my worn coat pocket, bypassing the loose change and the cheap keys, and pulled out a pristine, matte black, heavily encrypted satellite phone. It was a stark, jarring contrast to the poverty I projected. I pressed my thumb against the biometric scanner. The screen glowed to life, instantly displaying no apps, no contacts, just a secure dialing interface. I typed in a 12-digit international number and waited. The line clicked open on the second ring. A crisp, highly professional voice spoke immediately. "Wallace here." "Wallace it is, Cliff," I said, staring through the rain-streaked windshield at the glowing windows of my son's mansion. "The test is over." There was a brief pause on the line. I understand, sir. Shall I assume the results were unfavorable? They shut the door in my face in a freezing storm and told me to find a homeless shelter. I replied, my voice devoid of any emotion. They failed, Wallace. They failed spectacularly. Very well, sir, Wallace responded, the sound of rapid typing echoing in the background. Initiating asset unfreeze protocols now. What Morgan and Cameron did not know, what they had been too arrogant to ever investigate, was that I was not broke. I had not gone bankrupt paying for Diane's medical bills. 30 years ago, I founded a high-security logistics firm specializing in moving off-the-books assets for global pharmaceutical companies. I built an empire in the shadows, navigating international trade laws and securing contracts that governments did not even know existed. 5 years ago, I quietly sold the entire operation to a private equity firm for $60 million. When Diane got sick, we paid out of pocket for the best experimental treatments in the world, completely off the grid. When she passed away, my son's immediate reaction had not been grief, but a frantic audit of my remaining bank accounts. He wanted to know what he was inheriting. That was when I knew I had to test him. I placed my entire $60 million fortune into an impenetrable, multi-tiered blind trust managed by Wallace. I moved into a dilapidated apartment, bought a rusted truck, and told my son the medical bills had wiped me out. I wanted to see if he would love his father without the promise of a massive inheritance. I wanted to see if the boy I raised had survived the toxic greed of the woman he married. He had not. Wallace, I said into the satellite phone, the heater in the truck finally kicking in. Liquidate the secondary portfolio. I want you to initiate the purchase of the Summit Lodge in Aspen. Pay entirely in cash through the primary shell corporation. The Summit Lodge, Sir Wallace asked, his typing pausing for a fraction of a second. Are you certain that property is currently listed at $12 million and requires extensive structural renovations? I am completely certain, I replied, staring at the foreclosure notice I had retrieved from my duffel bag. But before we finalize the purchase, I need you to confirm something for me. Who holds the primary contracting bid for the renovations on that specific estate? There was a hum of data processing on the line. I am pulling up the escrow files now, sir. That is interesting. The primary contracting bid for the Summit Lodge renovations was submitted by Apex Construction. That is your son Cameron's firm. I smiled in the darkness of the truck. It was not a happy smile. It was the smile of a predator watching a rat walk willingly into a steel trap. Cameron was desperate. He was facing foreclosure, drowning in $80,000 of immediate debt, and his failing construction firm was bleeding money. He needed a massive, high-profile contract to save his life. He was banking on scamming the anonymous billionaire buying the Aspen Lodge to cover his tracks. He had no idea the anonymous billionaire was the father he just left to freeze in the rain. Approve his bid, Phyllis. I ordered, my voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. Approve the contract, but bury a performance clause in the addendums. Give him access to the initial escrow funds. Let him think he has won the lottery, but tie every single cent to strict, verifiable milestones. I want him legally bound to the shell company. Consider it done, Sir Wallace replied smoothly. I will have the transport team pick you up at the edge of the community in 10 minutes. We have a suite prepared for you at the Four Seasons while we finalize the Aspen acquisition. I hung up the phone. I looked at the mansion one last time, watching the caterers moving around the brightly lit kitchen, preparing for a party funded by credit cards and lies. I put the truck in gear and drove away from my son's house, leaving the illusion of the helpless, broken father behind in the storm. The silent reckoning had officially begun. The crisp alpine wind bit at my face as I stood on the sprawling wraparound balcony of the Summit Lodge. Below me, the valley fell away into a breathtaking expanse of pine and snow, a $12 million view that belonged entirely to me. But I was not looking at the majestic mountains or the clear blue sky. My eyes were locked on the thick stack of premium paper resting on the heavy cedar railing. It was the master renovation proposal from Apex Construction, my son's company. I flipped to the itemized budget, my thumb tracing the dense columns of numbers Cameron had submitted to the anonymous holding company that now owned this estate. I had spent 30 years running high-security logistics. I knew how to read a spreadsheet. I knew how to follow the money, and I knew how to spot a bleeder. And Cameron was hemorrhaging. The numbers were not just inflated. They were an absolute insult to anyone with a basic understanding of commerce. He was charging a 400% markup on reclaimed timber that I knew wholesale suppliers practically gave away. He had listed $250,000 for foundation reinforcement, a job the original structural inspection report clearly stated was completely unnecessary. I turned the page, the cold wind threatening to snatch the paper from my hands. He had invented phantom subcontractors. There were shell vendors with vague, generic names charging exorbitant hourly rates for electrical consultations that did not exist. He had billed for imported Italian marble when the architectural plans specifically requested local river stone. It was a masterpiece of pure financial desperation. Cameron was not trying to renovate a mountain cabin. He was trying to rob a faceless billionaire to save his own sinking ship. He was trying to extract exactly enough cash to stop the foreclosure on his luxury estate and fund his wife's endless consumption. I felt a heavy ache in my chest, a phantom pain completely unrelated to my age or the altitude. I remembered standing in the backyard of our old house 30 years ago, placing a heavy steel hammer into Cameron's small, eager hand. I had taught him how to measure twice and cut once. I had taught him that a man's integrity was built directly into the foundation of his work, that you never took a dollar you did not honestly earn. Diane had watched us from the kitchen window, smiling warmly as her husband and son built a simple wooden shed together. If she could see this fraudulent document now, if she could see the man our boy had become, it would have broken her heart. Cameron had traded the calluses of an honest living for the slippery hands of a white-collar thief. He believed he had found a golden goose. He thought he had stumbled upon a rich absentee owner he could milk dry to pay off his impending debts. He had absolutely no idea the faceless tycoon he was trying to swindle was the exact same man he had left to freeze in the rain just a few days earlier. He was trying to rob his own father. I pulled a heavy silver pen from my coat pocket and uncapped it. Wallace, my wealth manager, had done exactly as I instructed. Buried deep on page 47 of the dense legal approval addendum was a lethal performance clause. It was drafted with terrifying precision. The clause gave Cameron immediate access to the initial escrow funds, giving him the temporary intoxicating illusion of financial salvation. He would see that wire transfer hit his failing bank account and believe he had won the lottery. But the fine print legally bound every single subsequent payout to strict independent forensic audits. If Apex Construction failed to produce physical proof of materials purchased and labor rendered, the contract would trigger an automatic default. It would force Cameron to personally refund the entire initial deposit with devastating legal and financial penalties. It was a closed loop. I pressed the pen to the paper and signed the name of the Shell Corporation director. The trap was officially set. The steel jaws were locked open, and my son was willingly walking right into them, blinded by his own insatiable greed. I closed the folder, the heavy thud of the cardboard echoing sharply against the quiet mountain air. I turned my back on the valley and looked at the massive glass doors leading into the empty great room of my new lodge. The silence of the empty mansion was a stark contrast to the cramped, mold-infested apartment I had endured for the last 2 years. I had chosen that poverty. I had chosen to hide my $60 million fortune to test the loyalty of my family. I had wanted to see if they loved me or if they only loved what I could provide for them. The test was over, and the results were written in the fraudulent contract I held in my hands. Just as I stepped toward the glass doors, my encrypted satellite phone vibrated deeply in my coat pocket. I pulled it out, fully expecting an update from Wallace regarding the wire transfers. Instead, the high-resolution screen displayed a forwarded voicemail notification. The caller identification belonged to a local number I knew intimately well. I pressed play and held the heavy device to my ear. The voice that filled the silence of the balcony was drenched in a sickeningly sweet tone I had not heard in years. It was Morgan, my daughter-in-law. Cliff, darling. Her voice chimed perfectly, modulating a fake warmth that made my skin crawl. We have been thinking about you so much. Cameron and I feel just awful about the other night. The storm, the stress with the house, we were just overwhelmed and we took it out on you. We know that was wrong. We want to make things right. We want to bury the hatchet. We are hosting a small, intimate reconciliation dinner tomorrow night at the country club, just family. Please come. We miss you. Little Leo misses his grandfather so much. The audio file clicked off, returning me to the absolute silence of the mountain peak. I lowered the phone, my jaw clenching so hard my teeth ached. Morgan never apologized. Morgan never admitted fault to anyone, let alone the father-in-law she openly despised. And Morgan certainly never invited me to dinner at her exclusive country club unless she wanted to hide me in a dark corner and extract something highly valuable. She had just kicked me out into a freezing downpour. She had literally told me to go find a homeless shelter that accepted pensioners. A sudden honey-coated reconciliation dinner meant only one thing. The wolves were hungry and they needed a signature. They were drowning in debt, and they had found something else of mine they wanted to steal. The mention of my 5-year-old grandson was the most calculated manipulation of all. She knew I loved Leo more than anything, and she was dangling his presence like bait on a hook. I slid the phone back into my pocket, the cold mountain air filling my lungs. The game had shifted. They thought they were luring a helpless, destitute old man into a trap. They thought they could buy my compliance with a mediocre steak and a false apology. I looked down at the signed renovation contract resting on the cedar railing. I would go to their dinner. I would wear my oldest suit. I would let them smile and pour my wine. And I would sit quietly while they eagerly dug their own graves. A silver spoon tapped sharply against crystal. The high, clear ringing silenced the low murmur of our corner table at the upscale steakhouse. I sat perfectly still in the worn, faded charcoal suit I had owned for 20 years. It was the exact suit they expected the bankrupt, defeated version of their father to wear. Across the pristine white tablecloth, Morgan forced a bright, perfectly manicured smile that did not even begin to reach her cold, calculating eyes. Cameron sat beside her, constantly shifting his weight, his expensive silk tie suddenly looking very much like a leash. They had spent the first 40 minutes of the dinner performing a grotesque, suffocating pantomime of family affection. Morgan had personally poured my sparkling water. Cameron had asked hollow, rehearsed questions about my health and my new living arrangements, pretending he had not been the one to shut his heavy oak door in my face during a freezing rainstorm just days prior. It was a flawless, sickening charade. But predators can only play with their food for so long before their true nature inevitably takes over. Morgan cleared her throat, placing her wineglass down with deliberate care, signaling the definitive end of the pleasantries. Cameron immediately took his cue. He reached into his designer leather briefcase and pulled out a thick, cream-colored file folder. He placed it squarely next to my half-empty plate, his hands trembling just enough for me to notice. He did not look me in the eye. Instead, he stared at the center of the table and began a rapid, rehearsed monologue about temporary cash flow issues, market fluctuations, and the heavy burdens of maintaining a successful enterprise. I did not interrupt him. I let him spin his pathetic web of corporate jargon, waiting for the blade to drop. Then he finally said the words. He mentioned the Whispering Pines Cemetery. My chest tightened, though I did not let a single muscle in my face betray the emotion. Diane and I had purchased a double-family plot at Whispering Pines 40 years ago. Back then it was just a quiet rolling hill overlooking the valley, a peaceful place where we intended to rest side by side for eternity. But over the last 4 decades, the city had grown around it. The cemetery had been designated a historical landmark. It was now a completely sold-out, highly coveted sanctuary for the region's elite. A plot there was no longer just a piece of earth. It was a premium, appreciating asset. Cameron swallowed hard and tapped the file folder. He explained that a prime double plot at Whispering Pines was currently appraising on the private market for over $80,000. It was exactly the amount he needed to cover his missed commercial loan payment and stave off the foreclosure of his mansion. He slid a silver pen across the tablecloth, pushing it directly against my knuckles. He told me he needed me to sign the transfer deed tonight. He needed to liquidate the plot by tomorrow morning. He actually had the nerve to suggest with a perfectly straight face that we could simply exhume his mother's remains and move Diane to a more affordable modern facility outside the city limits. He framed it as a practical financial maneuver, a logical sacrifice to save his business from the consequences of his own terrible decisions. He calculated the cost of the exhumation, the transportation, and the cheaper burial plot, presenting the net profit to me as if he were pitching a brilliant corporate merger. I stared at the legal document resting on the table. The sheer breathtaking audacity of the request hung in the air between us. My wife's final resting place, the sacred ground where I had buried the only woman I ever loved, was nothing more than a poker chip to them. They were drowning in debts created by their own insatiable vanity, and their solution was to literally dig up my dead wife to pay for their luxury cars and imported marble countertops. I looked at Cameron. I looked at the boy I had taught to build birdhouses, the boy I had carried on my shoulders through the county fair, the boy who used to hold his mother's hand when she read him bedtime stories. I searched his face for any lingering trace of a conscience, any flicker of shame or hesitation. There was absolutely nothing. He was completely empty, hollowed out by the toxic ambition of the woman sitting next to him. He was entirely willing to disturb the sacred rest of the woman who gave him life just to keep his country club membership active for another month. I slowly reached out and placed my hand over the silver pen. Cameron exhaled a heavy sigh of relief, clearly believing I was broken enough to comply. Morgan's fake smile widened into a victorious smirk. I picked up the pen, looked down at the signature line on the transfer deed, and then deliberately set the pen down on the opposite side of the table. I placed my hand flat on the folder and slid it firmly back across the white linen. No. I said the word with an icy, absolute calm that seemed to lower the temperature in the room. Cameron blinked, his brow furrowing in genuine confusion. "Dad, you are not listening to me," he pleaded, his voice rising in panic. "I need this capital by tomorrow. I am facing total liquidation. If I lose the house, we lose everything. You do not need that expensive dirt. You are practically homeless right now anyway. What good is a premium burial plot to a man who cannot even afford a decent apartment?" I did not raise my voice. I simply leaned forward, resting my elbows on the table. "You will not touch your mother's grave, Cameron. You will not disturb her peace to fund your failures. You made your bed. Now you are going to sleep in it. I am not signing anything." The absolute finality in my tone struck him like a physical blow. He shrank back into his chair, utterly defeated, the panic in his eyes turning into raw, terrified realization. He knew I meant every word, but Morgan did not shrink back. The fake diplomatic mask she had worn all evening shattered into a million jagged pieces. Her face flushed a violent shade of red. She slammed her hands down on the table, causing the silverware to clatter loudly. "Are you out of your mind?" she hissed, her voice dripping with a venom so pure it was almost tangible. "You sit there wearing clothes that belong in a dumpster, completely destitute, and you dare to deny us we are the only family you have left. You ungrateful old fool." I did not flinch. I just stared at her, absorbing the absolute vitriol she was spewing. My silence only fueled her rage. She stood up, her chair scraping harshly against the hardwood floor, drawing the alarmed attention of every diner in our immediate vicinity. She did not care who was listening. She wanted to humiliate me. She wanted to break me down in front of a room full of strangers. "You are a useless relic, Cliff," she shouted, her voice echoing off the vaulted ceiling of the restaurant. "You let your landlord throw you out onto the street like trash. You are a pathetic, bankrupt failure who cannot even take care of himself, let alone contribute to this family. Cameron was going to generously let you stay in our guest house if you signed that paper." We were going to save you from freezing in your miserable truck, but you are too stupid and too stubborn to accept a lifeline. You would rather cling to a patch of dirt than help your own son survive. People at the surrounding tables had stopped eating. Waiters stood frozen near the kitchen doors. Everyone was watching the wealthy, furious woman verbally annihilating the quiet, poorly dressed old man. Cameron stood up, his face pale, muttering for her to lower her voice, but she shrugged him off violently. She leaned over the table, her face inches from mine, her eyes blazing with absolute hatred. "You are dead to us, Cliff," she spat, her voice trembling with fury. "Do you hear me? You will never see your grandson again. You will die alone in whatever miserable shelter you manage to crawl into, and we will not pay a single dime to bury you. Come on, Cameron. We are leaving. I am not spending another second looking at this pathetic excuse for a father." She grabbed her expensive designer coat and turned on her heel, storming toward the front exit with heavy, furious strides. Cameron lingered for a split second. He looked at me, his eyes wide and terrified, a man who realized his entire world was collapsing around him. He opened his mouth as if he wanted to apologize, as if he wanted to beg for one last chance, but Morgan barked his name from the foyer. Cameron swallowed hard, lowered his head like a beaten dog, and hurried after her, desperate to stay on his leash. They left me sitting alone at the table, in the dead center of the upscale restaurant. The silence they left in their wake was heavy and uncomfortable. I could feel the pitying stares of the other patrons burning into my back. A waiter cautiously approached the table, holding a small leather booklet containing the massive bill they had deliberately left behind for their destitute father to cover. I did not look at the waiter. I did not look at the bill. My eyes were locked entirely on the empty space on the white tablecloth where the cream-colored file folder had been resting just moments ago. My heart skipped a single cold beat. When Cameron had stood up in his panic to follow his screaming wife, he had snatched the folder off the table. He took the original transfer deed with him. I sat back in my chair, the chill of realization washing over me. Cameron knew I would never willingly sign away Diane's grave. He knew I had shut the door on his salvation. But he was a desperate man facing total financial ruin, and desperate men do not simply accept defeat when salvation is resting in their briefcase. He took the unsigned document because he was completely out of legal options. There was only one conceivable reason he would take a blank transfer deed for a highly valuable asset when the rightful owner had expressly and aggressively forbidden its sale. The trap I had laid with the Aspen Lodge was already quietly in motion, but Cameron had just bypassed that entirely and ignited a new, deeply personal war right here. He was not just going to try to scam an anonymous billionaire anymore. He was going to forge my signature. He was going to illegally steal his own mother's grave to save himself, and he was going to do it tomorrow morning. The heavy glass door of Wallace's downtown office shut with a soft click, sealing us inside a soundproof vault of mahogany and steel. I sat in a high-backed leather chair, staring at the glaring white light of a high-resolution monitor resting on the polished desk. Displayed on the screen was a digital scan of a legal document. It was the transfer deed for the Whispering Pines burial plot. The very same cream-colored paper Cameron had slid across the restaurant table just 14 hours ago. I leaned forward, resting my hands on the cool wood of the desk. My eyes traced the blue ink at the bottom of the page. There, on the signature line, was my name perfectly replicated. The loops and harsh angles of my handwriting had been forged with a terrifying precision. I did not shout. I did not slam my fist against the desk. I simply stared at the signature, feeling the last remaining shreds of my paternal mercy evaporate into the cold, conditioned air of the office. A man does not learn to forge his father's signature overnight. It takes practice. It takes a profound, chilling lack of conscience to sit in a quiet room and meticulously trace the letters of the man who gave you life, knowing those letters will be used to betray him. Cameron had not made a split-second decision born of panic. He had planned this. He had studied my handwriting, practiced it, and waited for the moment I refused him. When I walked away from that table, he did not see a boundary. He saw a minor inconvenience to bypass. I remembered buying that plot of earth 40 years ago. Diane and I had packed a picnic basket and drove up the hill when it was just an empty field of wild grass. Cameron was 3 years old, running around catching grasshoppers, while Diane and I signed the original papers on the hood of my truck. We made a promise that day to rest beside each other for eternity. That piece of earth was not a financial asset. It was a vow. And my son had just stolen it to pay for his wife's leased luxury vehicles and country club fees. He had literally reached into the ground and robbed his own mother. Wallace sat silently across from me, his hands folded neatly over a dark gray tablet. He had been managing my wealth for nearly a decade, and he knew better than to offer hollow sympathies. He operated in a world of absolute discretion and calculated strikes. "When was this filed?" I asked, my voice dropping to a low, gravelly whisper that barely disturbed the silence of the room. "It was processed through an expedited digital notary at 7 o'clock this morning," Wallace replied, tapping the screen to bring up a secondary document. Cameron utilized a private escrow service that caters to high-net-worth individuals seeking rapid liquidations. The notary stamp is completely legitimate, which means he either bribed the official or he had someone who looks remarkably like you present a fake identification. Either way, the deed has been irrevocably transferred. The money was wired into his primary corporate holding account exactly 42 minutes ago. The sheer speed of the transaction revealed the depth of his desperation. He had left the restaurant with Morgan driven straight home and executed a felony before the sun had even fully risen. He had crossed the absolute final line. Up until this exact second, my plan had been to teach him a severe financial lesson through the Aspen cabin renovation. I had intended to let him bankrupt himself against my performance clauses, to strip away his arrogant facade and force him to rebuild his life from the dirt up. I had wanted to save him from himself. But looking at the forged ink over my wife's resting place, that desire vanished. I no longer looked at the screen and saw the actions of a misguided child. I saw a ruthless thief who needed to be excised from society before he destroyed anyone else. "What is the legal definition of this transaction, Wallace?" I asked, leaning back in the chair and crossing my arms. Wallace adjusted his glasses, his expression perfectly devoid of pity. "It is a multi-tiered felony, sir. By transmitting a fraudulently signed legal document across state lines to a digital escrow service, he has committed federal wire fraud. The forgery of the deed itself constitutes grand theft of a premium real estate asset. Furthermore, because he utilized his corporate account to receive the illicit funds, he has entangled his construction firm in money laundering. If these documents are handed over to a federal prosecutor, he is looking at a mandatory minimum sentence in a federal penitentiary. Morgan would likely be indicted as a co-conspirator, given that the funds were immediately routed to cover debts in her name. The hammer had fallen. They had built their own scaffold and happily tied the noose. But I needed to know the final piece of the puzzle. I needed to know who was sitting on the other side of that transaction. Someone had purchased the plot, and I needed to buy it back immediately, regardless of the cost. I would not let strangers bury their dead on top of Diane. "Find the buyer," I commanded, staring out the floor-to-ceiling windows at the sprawling city skyline below. "Contact their representatives. Offer them double whatever Cameron sold it for. Triple it, if you have to. I want that deed back in my name before the end of the business day." Wallace did not immediately reach for his phone. Instead, a strange, highly uncharacteristic silence stretched across the desk. I turned away from the window and looked at him. He was staring at his tablet with an expression of profound disbelief. For a man who managed billions of dollars in off-the-grid logistics, to look surprised meant something statistically impossible had just occurred. "We do not need to contact the buyer to," Wallace said, his voice unusually quiet. I narrowed my eyes. "Why not?" "Because the buyer is us," Wallace replied slowly, turning the tablet around and sliding it across the polished mahogany so I could read the screen. I looked at the digital transaction record. The purchasing entity was listed as a subsidiary holding company named Vanguard Heritage Acquisitions. It took my mind a fraction of a second to recognize the corporate structure. It was one of my own shell companies. It was an automated wealth preservation trust I had set up 5 years ago to quietly purchase historically significant real estate and conserve it. I looked up at Wallace, the sheer staggering irony of the situation taking the air from my lungs. "You bought it." "The algorithm bought it," Wallace corrected, adjusting his tie. "The Whispering Pines Cemetery is classified as a premium historical landmark. Assets there rarely hit the open market. When Cameron used the private escrow service to quietly dump the deed at a heavily reduced price for a fast cash turnaround, it triggered an alert in our acquisition software. The algorithm recognized a severely undervalued heritage asset and executed an automated cash purchase within seconds. It bypassed human oversight entirely because the purchase price was well below the pre-approved authorization limit. I stared at the screen, feeling a cold, hollow laugh rising in the back of my throat. My son had stolen his mother's grave to save his mansion from foreclosure. But the money that saved him the $80,000 that had just hit his failing corporate account had come directly from my own vault. He had robbed me and sold the stolen goods right back to me in the same breath. He thought he had outsmarted a destitute old man, but he had just committed federal wire fraud against a multi-million-dollar shadow corporation that I owned. The trap I had been carefully building around the Aspen cabin was suddenly completely unnecessary for their destruction. I already possessed the smoking gun. I held the forged deed, the routing numbers, the undeniable digital footprint of a federal crime executed directly against my own legal entities. I did not need to wait for him to fail the construction milestones in the mountains. I had the power to annihilate his entire existence right here, right now, with a single phone call to the federal prosecutor. But handing the evidence over to the authorities immediately would not give me what I truly needed. A sterile courtroom arrest would allow Morgan to play the victim. She would hire expensive defense attorneys with the last of their credit and spin a narrative of a tragic misunderstanding. She would claim Cameron acted alone. She would grab my grandson Leo and run painting me as the vindictive father destroying a family. I could not allow that. I needed them to walk willingly into a room where there were no exits, no excuses, and no shadows left to hide in. I needed to strip them of their arrogance before I took their freedom. Sir Wallace asked quietly, sensing the dangerous shift in my demeanor. "Shall I contact the federal authorities? We have a mountain of incontrovertible proof." The Bureau would freeze his accounts before he even finished his morning coffee. "No," I replied, keeping my voice deadly calm. "Let him keep the money for now. Let him pay his mortgage and feel the intoxicating relief of a successful crime. Let Morgan gloat in her sprawling mansion, believing she has finally discarded the useless relic of her father-in-law. We are going to let them feel completely, utterly untouchable." Wallace nodded slowly, a faint glimmer of understanding in his eyes. "And the Aspen estate contract, sir? We proceed exactly as planned," I instructed, standing up from the leather chair. "Cameron thinks he has secured his financial future through theft and deception. He thinks he is about to embark on a highly lucrative renovation project for a faceless billionaire. Let him gather his tools. Let him pack his designer bags. Let him drive his family up into the mountains to claim his prize. Because when he kicks down the doors of that $12 million cabin, expecting to find his salvation, he is going to find me sitting at the head of the table." I walked toward the heavy glass door of the office, pausing for a single moment to look back at the digital scan of the forged signature. They had crossed the line to steal my past. Now I was going to leverage the full devastating weight of my empire to permanently dismantle their future. We were going to Aspen, and they had absolutely no idea they were walking into their own funeral. Stacks of thick financial audits covered every square inch of the massive live-edge oak dining table in the center of the Aspen cabin. Outside the floor-to-ceiling glass windows, a brutal mountain blizzard was tearing through the ancient pine trees, but the temperature inside the $12 million lodge felt even colder. The fire roaring in the massive stone hearth offered absolutely no warmth against the chilling reality of the documents spread before me. I sat at the head of the table staring at a glowing digital ledger on my encrypted tablet. Wallace stood at the far end of the room sorting through a fresh stack of bank statements, his expression completely devoid of emotion. We had been working in absolute silence for 6 hours, systematically peeling back the rotten, decaying layers of Cameron's failing construction empire. I had spent 30 years building an international logistics firm that moved highly sensitive assets across global borders without leaving a single footprint. I knew how to hide money, and more importantly, I knew exactly how to find it. Cameron, on the other hand, was an amateur playing a dangerous game he simply did not understand. He had left a trail of financial breadcrumbs so wide and clumsy, it was an insult to the very concept of white-collar crime. He believed he was a master manipulator navigating the complex world of high-end real estate. But the ledgers told the story of a desperate, panicked man plugging holes in a sinking ship with stolen wood. "Look at the escrow accounts for the Davidson project," I told Wallace, sliding a printed spreadsheet across the smooth surface of the table. The Davidsons paid Apex Construction a $400,000 deposit last November to begin framing their custom home on the lake. Look at where that money went within 48 hours of the wire transfer clearing their bank. Wallace picked up the paper, adjusting his glasses under the stark light of the chandelier. He transferred $300,000 directly into a subsidiary holding account under the guise of an advanced material purchase. Wallace noted, his voice clinically detached. But the vendor he paid does not exist. The tax identification number routes back to a defunct shell company registered to a vacant strip mall in Delaware. I nodded, feeling a heavy, sickening knot pull tight in my stomach. Cameron was not just a terrible businessman drowning in debt due to market fluctuations or poor management. He was an active, malicious predator. He was systematically robbing his own clients. People who trusted him to build their homes were depositing their life savings into his escrow accounts, and Cameron was illegally siphoning those funds to artificially inflate his own failing enterprise. He was robbing Peter to pay Paul, running a rudimentary Ponzi scheme disguised as a luxury construction firm. Every time a new client signed a contract, he used their deposit to cover the outstanding debts of the previous unfinished project, leaving a trail of half-built houses and ruined families in his wake. But the true sickness of the betrayal was not just how the money was stolen, it was where the stolen money was ultimately bleeding out. I pulled up the corresponding personal expense reports for Cameron and Morgan over the last 18 months. I instructed Wallace to cross-reference the exact dates of the fraudulent escrow withdrawals with Morgan's personal credit card payments. The results materialized on the large monitor screen in a matter of seconds, painting a grotesque portrait of vanity and pure, unadulterated greed. On the 12th of October, Cameron illegally diverted $50,000 from a client's roofing budget, claiming severe supply chain delays. On the 14th of October, Morgan charged exactly $48,000 at a boutique jeweler in Beverly Hills for a custom diamond tennis bracelet. On the 3rd of March, Cameron drained $80,000 from a plumbing reserve fund, leaving a family of 4 living in a hotel while their home sat unfinished. 2 days later, Morgan paid off a massive outstanding balance at her exclusive country club and chartered a private jet for a weekend shopping excursion to Milan with her friends. On the 9th of July, Cameron completely liquidated a landscaping trust, and the very next morning, Morgan purchased a fleet of imported Italian marble statues for their own private garden. The data was incontrovertible and utterly damning. My son had completely abandoned every single moral principle I had ever taught him. He was committing federal wire fraud and risking decades in a federal penitentiary, not to keep a roof over his family's head or to put food on their table, but to actively finance his wife's vanity. He was destroying the lives of innocent clients just so Morgan could parade around her gated community in designer clothes pretending to be royalty. He had traded his soul and his freedom to keep a toxic, entitled woman from throwing a tantrum. I stared at the endless rows of luxury purchases, feeling the last remaining ounce of paternal sympathy die in my chest. The boy I had raised, the son I had taught to build birdhouses and measure wood in our backyard, was dead. The man who had forged my signature to steal my wife's grave to cover a missed mortgage payment was nothing more than a parasite. He deserved absolutely no mercy. The quiet endurance I had practiced for the last 2 years evaporated instantly, replaced by a cold, calculated wrath. I was no longer a disappointed father mourning the loss of his son. I was an apex predator auditing my prey, preparing to systematically dismantle every single aspect of their stolen lives. I pushed the tablet away, rubbing the bridge of my nose as a wave of absolute exhaustion washed over me. "We have enough evidence to put him away for 20 years, I said to Wallace, the silence of the cabin amplifying the harsh truth of my words. "We have the forged deed, we have the escrow fraud, and we have the money laundering trail leading directly to his personal accounts. Compile the entire dossier. We are going to lock him inside a legal cage he can never escape from." Wallace did not immediately respond. He was staring intensely at a secondary monitor, his fingers flying across his keyboard with sudden, frantic urgency. The rhythmic clicking of the keys was the only sound in the vast room. "Sir," he said, his voice uncharacteristically tense, breaking his usual professional composure. "There is an anomaly in the routing data." I stood up from the heavy leather chair and walked around the massive oak table standing over his shoulder to look at the screen. "What kind of anomaly?" I asked, narrowing my eyes at the complex web of offshore banking codes scrolling rapidly across his monitor. "Cameron's embezzlement strategy is incredibly sloppy," Wallace explained, tracing a line of green data with the tip of his silver pen. "He routes the stolen client funds through cheap domestic shell companies and then immediately dumps the cash into his personal accounts to pay off Morgan's credit cards. It is a straight, desperate line from point A to point B. It leaves a massive digital footprint that any first-year forensic accountant could follow in their sleep. But there is a secondary current of money here, a completely different financial signature buried underneath the primary fraud." I leaned closer, watching the algorithm untangle a deeply buried web of wire transfers. Someone had been siphoning an additional 10% off the top of every single fraudulent transaction Cameron made. Every time Cameron stole $100,000 from a client, someone else was quietly redirecting $10,000 of that stolen money into the shadows. But this secondary stream of cash was not going to Beverly Hills jewelers or domestic country clubs. This money was being meticulously washed through a highly sophisticated tumbler of international crypto exchanges bouncing between servers in Eastern Europe and Asia before being quietly parked in an offshore account in Dubai. This level of digital obfuscation required a sharp, calculating mind. It required extreme patience and a deep, masterful understanding of international banking loopholes. Cameron was entirely incapable of executing a scheme this complex. He was a panicked, desperate man trying to plug holes in a sinking ship by grabbing whatever cash was closest to him. He did not have the discipline, the foresight, or the intellect to build a secondary ghost account overseas and slowly bleed his own stolen funds into it over the course of 2 years. "Someone else is draining the accounts," I said, my voice dropping to a harsh whisper as the reality of the situation locked into place. "Someone is letting Cameron take all the legal risk for the escrow fraud while quietly stealing the stolen money right out from under him. They are using him as a shield while they build an escape fund." Wallace hit the final decryption key on his keyboard, breaking through the last layer of international banking privacy protocols. The secure server hesitated for a fraction of a second before the true ownership records of the Dubai account flashed onto the glaring white screen, illuminating the dark room. The hidden offshore account containing the last remaining scraps of Cameron's stolen wealth did not belong to my son. The heavy thud of a thick manila envelope hitting the solid oak dining table shattered the freezing silence of the Aspen cabin. Arthur, a private investigator I had kept on a lucrative retainer for over 2 decades, did not bother taking off his snow-dusted coat. He simply tapped a thick gloved finger against the center of the sealed package. "We found." The ghost Arthur rasped, his breath still visible in the cold air of the great room. "The offshore entity controlling the Dubai cryptocurrency tumblers is not registered to your son. It took 3 layers of international subpoenas and a contact inside the Emirati Banking Authority, but the signature matches perfectly. I pulled the envelope toward me, ripping the thick paper open. I slid the stack of intercepted banking dossiers across the polished wood. The primary beneficiary of the hidden offshore account was printed in bold, undeniable black ink. Morgan. The sheer, breathtaking malice of the revelation settled over the room like a suffocating blanket. Cameron had not been building a secret escape hatch for his family. He had been completely blind to the fact that his own wife was actively bleeding him dry. I traced the dates of the wire transfers, cross-referencing them with the escrow thefts we had uncovered just moments ago. A terrifying, meticulous pattern emerged on the glowing screens. Morgan knew everything. She knew Cameron was embezzling from his clients, and instead of stopping him, she was quietly skimming the very top off his stolen funds. Every time Cameron panicked and stole $100,000 to cover a massive landscaping bill or a country club debt, Morgan intercepted $10,000 and wired it directly into the shadows. She had weaponized his desperation. She was letting my son take the absolute entirety of the federal legal risk, while she siphoned the illicit profits into an untouchable, untraceable sanctuary halfway across the globe. She had played him for an absolute fool. While Cameron sweated over forged signatures and juggled irate clients demanding to know why their homes were not being built, Morgan was calmly liquidating his crimes into untraceable digital currency. She was sitting at her vanity mirror, applying expensive cosmetics, purchased with stolen money, completely aware that the federal authorities were inevitably going to kick down their front door. She had factored his eventual arrest into her financial planning. But the financial treachery was only the surface of her sociopathy. Arthur reached into the inside pocket of his heavy coat and pulled out a single, freshly printed sheet of glossy paper. He laid it gently over the banking ledgers. It was a digital flight itinerary, a one-way first-class ticket on a private luxury airline departing from Denver International Airport. The destination was Dubai. The departure time was exactly 48 hours from now. I stared at the passenger manifest. There was only one name listed: Morgan. I flipped the page over, searching the margins, looking for a secondary booking, looking for the name of my 5-year-old grandson. The page was blank. There was no ticket for Cameron. There was no ticket for little Leo. The air in my lungs turned to ice. She was not just fleeing a sinking ship. She was actively detonating the hull and locking the lifeboats. Morgan knew the federal authorities were going to catch up to Cameron's clumsy, desperate escrow fraud. She had calculated the blast radius of his impending arrest and decided to simply step outside of it, leaving her husband to face decades in a federal penitentiary and leaving her own 5-year-old son completely abandoned in the wreckage. I closed my eyes, a sickening wave of revulsion washing over me. I remembered Leo sitting on my lap just last Christmas, his small hands clumsily trying to unwrap a wooden toy train I had carved for him. Morgan had snatched it away, claiming the untreated wood would give him splinters, and handed him a cold, flashing tablet instead. She had always viewed the boy as an accessory, a prop, to be dressed in designer clothes for social media validation. But to abandon a 5-year-old child to the chaos of a federal indictment, to leave him alone in a foreclosed mansion with a father who was about to be dragged away in handcuffs, was a level of depravity that defied human comprehension. She was going to board a luxury flight, sip champagne at 30,000 feet, and never look back. The cold, calculated wrath that had been building inside me crystallized into an absolute, immovable directive. The stolen money no longer mattered. The forged deed to Diane's grave no longer mattered. The only thing that possessed any value in this entire miserable equation was Leo. My grandson was currently trapped in a house with a desperate felon and a fleeing fugitive, entirely oblivious to the fact that his mother was packing her bags to erase him from her life. He was sleeping in a bedroom that the bank was about to seize, completely defenseless against the storm his parents had summoned. I pushed my chair back from the table, the heavy wood scraping loudly against the stone floor. "I am going to Denver right now," I said, my voice vibrating with a dangerous, quiet authority. Wallace, I want you to wake up the senior partners at the law firm. Draft an emergency ex parte custody order. Cite immediate endangerment, flight risk, and federal wire fraud. I will not let that child spend another night under their roof. I grabbed my keys from the edge of the table, turning toward the heavy timber doors. Every muscle in my body was coiled tightly with a singular protective instinct. I had lost Cameron to his own vanity decades ago, but I would rather burn my entire $60 million empire to the ground than let Leo become collateral damage in Morgan's escape plan. But before I could take a single step toward the exit, the shrill, jarring alarm of a high-priority security breach echoed through the cabin. The sound was piercing, designed to instantly halt any ongoing operation. Wallace stood frozen at his workstation, his face illuminated by a flashing red warning on his primary monitor. The biometric security protocols on the shell company servers were blaring a rapid warning tone. "Cliff, wait." Wallace commanded, his voice tight with sudden, uncharacteristic alarm. "Do not leave this room. Morgan is not going to Dubai. The itinerary was a contingency plan, and she just canceled it." I turned back, the heavy iron key biting painfully into the palm of my hand. Why would she cancel a fully funded escape route when she knows the feds are closing in? Wallace looked up from the glowing screen, his jaw set in a grim, rigid line. "Because they found the leak, Cliff. Morgan and Cameron just intercepted a flagged email from the county clerk's office regarding the property tax transfers. The veil of anonymity is breached. They know the Aspen cabin is not owned by a faceless international conglomerate. They know it is registered to you." I stared at the blinking red light on the monitor. The parameters of the war had just violently shifted. They believed I was a broken, destitute old man who had miraculously stumbled into a $12 million piece of real estate. They did not see danger. They only saw a vulnerable target. Morgan was not running away anymore, because her insatiable greed had just overridden her survival instinct. She was coming here to take the lodge. The sharp, blaring sound of a digital alarm shattered the heavy silence of the cabin. It was not a fire alarm or a security breach at the perimeter. It was a high-pitched, rhythmic warning tone radiating directly from the speakers of Wallace's primary workstation. I turned away from the glowing ledgers of Morgan's hidden offshore accounts and looked across the massive oak table. The stark white light of Wallace's monitor had violently shifted to a pulsing, aggressive crimson red. The color reflected off his glasses, painting his usually stoic face in the harsh glow of an absolute catastrophe. "What is that?" I asked, my voice cutting through the noise with a low, dangerous edge. Wallace did not answer immediately. His fingers were a blur across the keyboard, typing with a frantic, punishing speed that I had never witnessed in all our years of working together. He was opening diagnostic windows, tracing digital pathways, and running localized defense protocols. The red light continued to pulse, casting long, menacing shadows against the timber walls of the great room. Outside, the Aspen blizzard howled against the reinforced glass, but the true storm had just breached our walls. Sir Wallace said, his voice unusually tight and strained. "We have a severe containment failure. The anonymity veil on Vanguard Heritage Acquisitions has just been compromised." I closed my eyes for a fraction of a second, absorbing the weight of his words. Vanguard Heritage was the primary shell corporation, holding the deed to this very cabin. It was a phantom entity buried under layers of impenetrable corporate armor, designed specifically to shield my identity from the world, and more importantly, from my own son. "Explain," I commanded, stepping closer to the workstation. "How does an impenetrable trust suddenly spring a leak?" "It was not a digital hack," Wallace replied, shaking his head in profound frustration. "It was human error at the absolute lowest level of the bureaucratic chain. When Cameron submitted his initial renovation permits to the local municipal planning office, the county clerk required a standard beneficiary disclosure form to authorize the heavy machinery access. It is a completely routine piece of local paperwork. However, the clerk bypassed our secure legal portal and manually queried the state tax registry using an outdated municipal database. That archaic system automatically pulled the originating guarantor data instead of the corporate proxy. "Speak plainly, Wallace. Who saw what?" Wallace stopped typing. The alarm ceased, leaving a ringing silence in the massive room. The clerk inadvertently generated an unredacted property tax addendum and emailed it directly to the primary contractor on file to verify the construction permits. The primary contractor is Apex Construction. Cameron received the document 10 minutes ago. The document clearly lists the sole living owner of this $12 million Aspen estate as Clifford Bennett. The gravity of the situation locked the air in my lungs. My son and my daughter-in-law had just spent the last 48 hours treating me like a destitute, homeless beggar. They had verbally annihilated me in the middle of a high-end restaurant. They had forged my signature to steal my dead wife's burial plot just to cover a late mortgage payment. Morgan had secretly booked a one-way flight to Dubai, fully intending to abandon her husband to a federal prison sentence and leave my 5-year-old grandson entirely alone in a foreclosed mansion. And now, at the absolute height of their desperate, malicious panic, a careless county clerk had just handed them a document proving that the pathetic old man they despised was actually sitting on a $12 million mountain fortress. "They know," I whispered, staring at the frozen red screen. "They know I own the lodge." Wallace nodded grimly. "They do not know about the $60 million offshore logistics empire, sir. The secondary trusts remain completely secure, but they know you own this specific property outright." I turned my back to the monitor and walked slowly toward the roaring stone fireplace. The flames danced and cracked over the dry logs, mimicking the chaotic, destructive energy currently spiraling out of control in my son's house. I placed my hands on the rough stone mantel and stared into the fire. Morgan was holding a first-class ticket to Dubai. She had siphoned the last remaining drops of Cameron's stolen escrow money to fund her escape. She was hours away from vanishing into the international shadows. But Morgan was a creature driven entirely by insatiable, bottomless greed. Her survival instinct was strong, but her entitlement was infinitely stronger. She believed I was a naive, foolish old man. She believed I was a broken relic who had somehow stumbled into a monumental sum of money. To a predator like Morgan, a $12 million estate belonging to a weak, defenseless father-in-law was not a warning sign. It was a ringing dinner bell. "Wallace," I said, keeping my gaze locked on the fire, "you initiated a full-spectrum communication intercept on their mobile devices when we discovered the forged cemetery deed. Are those intercepts still active?" "Yes, sir," Sir Wallace replied smoothly, the frantic energy leaving his voice replaced by his usual cold efficiency. "We have complete mirrored access to all their incoming and outgoing cellular traffic. I need to see what they are doing right now," I ordered. "Pull their messaging history. If Morgan knows I have $12 million in real estate, she is not getting on that plane to the Emirates. She is far too greedy to walk away from that kind of money." Wallace tapped a few keys. The large secondary monitor above his desk flickered to life. A stark black screen appeared, rapidly filling with green lines of intercepted text messages. The timestamp indicated the conversation was happening in real time. It was a direct, encrypted messaging thread between Cameron and Morgan. They were not even in the same room. The digital breadcrumbs indicated Morgan was at their country club, and Cameron was hiding in his home office. "Read it to me," I commanded, the cold wrath settling deep into my bones. Wallace cleared his throat, reading the green text with a clinical, detached precision. Incoming message from Cameron. "Morgan, you need to look at the document I just forwarded you from the county clerk. I do not understand what I am looking at. The guarantor for the Aspen Lodge is listed as my father. That is impossible. He was begging us to sleep in the guest house 3 days ago." Wallace paused as the screen populated with a new message. "Reply from Morgan. I am looking at it right now. I told you that old fool was hiding something when he refused to sell Diane's plot. He must have had a secret life insurance payout or a hidden pension fund he never told us about. He has been playing us, Cameron. He has been sitting on millions while we are drowning." The absolute hypocrisy of her words made my stomach churn. She was actively stealing stolen money from her own husband, yet she possessed the audacity to accuse me of deception. "Continue," I instructed. Incoming message from Cameron Wallace read, his voice dropping slightly. "Morgan, the bank is coming for the house on Monday. The forged deed money is not enough to clear the secondary loans. If my dad actually owns this lodge, we have to talk to him. We have to beg him for a loan." There was a long pause on the screen. The green cursor blinked rhythmically in the dark room, counting down the seconds of Morgan's toxic, calculating silence. I knew exactly what she was thinking. I knew exactly how her dark, parasitic mind operated. She was weighing the safety of Dubai against the sheer, glittering prize of an unencumbered Aspen estate. A massive block of text suddenly flooded the monitor. Wallace adjusted his glasses and read the final damning transmission. "Reply from Morgan. We are not begging that pathetic old relic for anything, Cameron. Do you honestly think he is going to hand over a dime after the way we treated him at dinner? He will laugh in our faces. We are taking a completely different route. Cancel the contractor flights. Cancel the supply trucks. I am canceling my trip to Dubai. Pack your bags right now. We are driving up to Aspen tonight." Wallace swallowed hard before reading the last few lines. "We are going to walk right into that cabin. We are going to establish immediate residency. Once we are inside, I will call my doctor and pay whatever it takes to get an expedited medical evaluation. We declare him legally incompetent due to severe, rapidly advancing dementia. We take full medical and financial power of attorney. We throw him into the cheapest state-run nursing home we can find, and we take the lodge. Do exactly as I say, Cameron. We are taking everything." The green text stopped scrolling. The silence in the cabin returned heavier and colder than the blizzard raging outside the glass. They were coming. They were abandoning their escape plans, abandoning their fraudulent construction schemes, and driving straight up the mountain to execute a hostile, deeply malicious takeover of my life. They fully intended to lock me in a psychiatric ward and steal the very roof over my head, Sir Wallace said quietly, breaking the heavy stillness of the room. "Should I activate the perimeter security? We can lock the estate down. We can have local law enforcement intercept their vehicle on the mountain pass and arrest them for the wire fraud before they even reach the front gates." I turned away from the fire and looked at Wallace. The anger was gone. The sorrow was gone. The only thing left was an absolute crystalline clarity. The trap had been sprung, but not the way I had initially designed it. They had bypassed the financial snares and walked directly into the emotional kill zone. They were bringing themselves to the slaughter fueled entirely by their own catastrophic hubris. "No," I replied, my voice echoing with a profound, terrifying calm. "Do not call the police. Do not engage the perimeter alarms. I want you to go down to the primary security console, Wallace. I want you to turn off the exterior floodlights. I want you to disable the gate sensors. And then I want you to walk over to those heavy double timber doors at the front of the lodge, and I want you to leave them completely unlocked. Let them drive up the mountain. Let them walk right in. We are going to give them exactly what they are coming for." Tires crunched violently against the packed gravel of the long, winding alpine driveway. The sound tore through the absolute stillness of the freezing mountain morning, harsh, invasive, and entirely unwelcome. A heavy luxury SUV, its leased engine whining in loud protest against the steep icy incline, skidded recklessly to a halt, just inches from the limestone steps of my cabin. I stood quietly near the roaring stone fireplace in the foyer, a mug of black coffee warming my hands, listening as car doors slammed with aggressive, echoing force. I did not have to wait for a knock. There was no knock. The massive custom-built oak doors at the entrance were kicked open with such violent momentum that the heavy brass hinges shrieked in protest. The freezing, biting wind of the Aspen blizzard rushed into the warm foyer, but it was absolutely nothing compared to the profound, toxic chill of the woman who stepped through the threshold. Morgan marched into the cabin, like a conqueror stepping onto freshly claimed territory. Her stiletto boots clicked fiercely against the reclaimed hardwood floors. She was dragging 3 massive pieces of designer luggage behind her, the expensive wheels leaving thick, wet tracks of mud and sleet across the pristine entryway. She did not pause to wipe her feet. She did not take off her fur-lined coat. She simply let go of her bags and stood there breathing hard, her eyes sweeping over the vaulted timber ceilings and the custom stonework with a look of ravenous, undisguised hunger. She was not looking at the cabin as a home. She was appraising it as a freshly captured asset, mentally tearing down walls and replacing fixtures before she had even greeted the owner. Cameron trailed closely behind her, pulling the heavy oak doors shut against the raging storm. He looked entirely exhausted, his shoulders slumped under the crushing, invisible weight of his own collapsing life. But his hands were gripping a thick, leather-bound clipboard with a desperate white-knuckle intensity. I recognized the cornered, panicked look in his eyes immediately. It was the exact same look he carried when he was caught stealing from my wallet as a teenager, a cowardly, pathetic mixture of guilt and misplaced defiance. But now he was not stealing $20 to save face with his friends. He was trying to steal my entire existence to save himself from a federal penitentiary. "We heard you scooped up that fancy cabin in Aspen." Morgan barked, her voice shattering the quiet dignity of the lodge. She stepped forward with an arrogant, entitled swagger, her eyes locking onto me. "And since you are obviously entirely incapable of managing an estate of this magnitude on your own, we decided to do the responsible thing. We are moving in to bury the hatchet cliff. We are taking over to make sure you do not hurt yourself." The sheer, breathtaking audacity of her words hung heavily in the air between us. Just a handful of days ago, this exact same woman had stood on the pristine porch of her foreclosed mansion and told me to go find a homeless shelter that accepted pensioners. She had slammed her door in my face while I stood freezing in the rain. She had called me a useless, bankrupt relic in the middle of a crowded, high-end restaurant, loudly threatening to completely erase my 5-year-old grandson from my life if I did not sign over my dead wife's burial plot. I knew with absolute certainty that she had a secret, fully funded, one-way first-class ticket to Dubai currently sitting in her email inbox. She had fully intended to abandon this very husband standing behind her to a federal wire fraud indictment. And yet here she was standing in my foyer wearing a smile so fabricated it looked physically painful, claiming she had driven through a blinding mountain blizzard out of the goodness of her heart. Cameron stepped out from behind her shadow, holding the clipboard out in front of his chest like a defensive shield. "Dad, you have to admit this is a massive, dangerous undertaking for a man your age," he said, his voice trembling with a nauseating, heavily rehearsed pity. "We saw the property tax transfers. We know you somehow managed to trick a bank or stumble into a blind trust to get your name on this deed. But let us be brutally realistic. You were living in a condemned, mold-infested apartment last week. You do not have the mental capacity or the financial literacy to maintain a $12 million property. The stress alone is going to give you a heart attack." He took another step forward, tapping a silver pen against the top page of the clipboard, actively attempting to gaslight his own father. "Morgan and I have consulted with some top-tier legal and medical professionals. Given your recent erratic behavior, your sudden, unexplained disappearance from the city, and your obvious rapid decline in cognitive function, we had this emergency power of attorney drawn up. It gives me full, immediate control over your medical decisions and your financial estate. It is entirely for your own protection, Dad. We just need you to sign it. We will move in, oversee the construction crews, handle the staffing, and make sure you are kept comfortable and safe in one of the lower guest suites. You will never have to worry about a single complex decision ever again." They were not just trying to rob me. They were actively trying to erase my humanity. They had driven up this mountain with a premeditated, thoroughly malicious plan to declare me legally insane, strip away my autonomy, and lock me in the basement of my own home while they liquidated my assets to pay for their spectacular criminal failures. Cameron had forged my signature to steal his mother's grave just 48 hours ago. Now he wanted me to willingly sign away the rest of my natural life. He wanted me to hand him the keys to his salvation, completely unaware that his beloved wife was going to leave him, holding the bag the second the federal authorities closed in on his massive, sloppy escrow embezzlement. I did not yell. I did not throw the piping hot mug of black coffee I was holding. I simply took a slow, deliberate sip, letting the bitter warmth wash over my tongue. I let the silence stretch out, forcing them to stand there, in the vast echoing foyer, without a response. Morgan's fake diplomatic smile began to twitch violently at the corners. The heavy, immovable silence was a weapon she simply did not know how to fight against. Do not stand there, playing the silent, stubborn martyr. Cliff Morgan snapped her mask completely, slipping to reveal the venomous, desperate creature underneath. We know you are in way over your head. You probably scammed some naive investor, but you cannot hide up here in the snow forever. The county knows you own it. The state knows you own it. And we are the only family you have left in this world. If you do not sign that document right now, I will personally drive back down this mountain wall Adult Protective Services and have you dragged out of here in a straitjacket. I will tell the judge you threatened us with a weapon. I will tell them you are a severe danger to yourself and others. You will spend the rest of your miserable life eating pureed food in a locked state-run psychiatric ward, and we will take this cabin anyway. Sign the paper. She was breathing heavily, her chest heaving with the exertion of her own toxic ambition. She honestly believed she had backed me into an inescapable, terrifying corner. She thought her aggression and her vile legal threats had paralyzed me with fear. She did not realize that my silence was not born of panic. It was the absolute laser-focused calm of a man watching a pair of blind, rabid wolves walk willingly into a steel cage and hand over the padlock. I slowly lowered my coffee mug, feeling the corner of my mouth pull up into a dark, razor-sharp smirk. I looked at Cameron, noting the pathetic, trembling grip he maintained on the clipboard, his eyes darting nervously toward the floor. Then I looked directly at Morgan, locking eyes with the woman who had systematically poisoned my son's soul and tried to abandon my grandson. "You want the lodge, Morgan?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper, yet it carried across the frozen foyer with terrifying clarity. She lifted her chin, her eyes flashing with triumphant, unadulterated greed. "It is not about what I want, Cliff. It is about what is absolutely necessary. You are unfit. We are taking over." I nodded slowly, stepping away from the warmth of the stone fireplace. I gestured with my empty hand toward the massive carved mahogany double doors leading directly into the main great room of the cabin. Then, by all means, I said, my voice completely devoid of the fear she so desperately wanted to hear. "Make yourselves right at home. The paperwork you are looking for is right through those doors. Go claim your prize." Morgan sneered, clearly interpreting my calm surrender as the pathetic, inevitable collapse of a weak, broken man. She snatched the clipboard out of Cameron's hands with a vicious jerk, her stilettos clicking fiercely against the wood as she pushed past me without a second glance. She marched toward the great room, her shoulders thrown back, projecting the absolute arrogance of a conqueror stepping into her newly acquired throne room. Cameron followed closely behind her, wiping a bead of nervous, clammy sweat from his forehead, eagerly anticipating the end of their financial nightmare and the beginning of his unearned luxury. Morgan grabbed the heavy brass handles and shoved the mahogany doors wide open, stepping forward, ready to dictate her final, ruthless terms. She took exactly 3 confident, strutting steps into the center of the massive room, and then she stopped dead. The smug, victorious smile was completely wiped from her face in an instant. Her designer bag slipped from her manicured fingers, hitting the hardwood floor with a dull, heavy thud. Every single drop of blood instantly drained from her cheeks, leaving her face the sickly, translucent color of dirty snow. She was completely paralyzed, her breath catching in her throat, as she stared at the absolute nightmare waiting for her around the dining table. Morgan stood absolutely paralyzed in the threshold. The heavy designer bag slipped from her manicured fingers and hit the hardwood floor with a dull, lifeless thud. She had marched into the Aspen Lodge expecting to find a confused old man cowering in an empty room. She had prepared a vicious, arrogant speech to strip away my autonomy and declare me legally insane. Instead, she was staring directly into an execution chamber. Sitting around the massive live-edge oak dining table was a nightmare assembly of the exact people she and Cameron had spent the last 2 years desperately avoiding. The great room was bathed in the harsh white glow of Wallace's monitors, but the true chill in the air came from the faces watching her. Wallace sat at the far end, his hands folded neatly over a stack of encrypted tablets. Next to him sat a stern, broad-shouldered man in a tailored charcoal suit whose posture screamed federal authority. Across from them sat the lead forensic auditor from Cameron's own construction firm, looking physically sick with guilt and fear. And occupying the remaining seats were the Davidsons, the Millers, and the Hendersons. They were the three major clients whose escrow accounts Cameron had completely drained to fund Morgan's luxury shopping sprees. I stepped into the room right behind a trembling Morgan. Cameron bumped into my shoulder as he blindly followed his wife inside, his eyes widening in sheer, unadulterated terror as he recognized the faces staring back at him. "Make yourselves comfortable," I said, my voice breaking the suffocating silence of the room. "We were just reviewing your forgery on Diane's grave." Cameron dropped his fraudulent power of attorney clipboard. It clattered against the stone tiles, echoing loudly against the vaulted timber ceilings. He looked at Mr. Davidson, whose dream home on the lake had been left as a rotting wooden skeleton, while Cameron siphoned his life savings to pay for imported marble statues. He looked at Mrs. Miller, who had been forced to move her 3 children into a cramped roadside hotel because Cameron claimed the plumbing budget had been consumed by unavoidable supply chain issues. The absolute hatred radiating from the betrayed clients was a tangible physical force in the room. They did not shout. They did not curse. They simply glared at the man who had ruined their lives. The man in the charcoal suit stood up. He did not offer a polite greeting. He placed a heavy stack of printed federal indictments onto the center of the polished wood table. "My name is Thomas Vance," he said, his voice operating like a flat surgical instrument. "I am a prosecutor for the federal government. For the last 4 hours, we have been running a real-time forensic audit of your corporate accounts, Mr. Bennett. We have definitively traced $3.2 million in stolen client funds directly from your business escrow accounts into your personal routing numbers. Furthermore, we have secured digital confirmation from the private notary service you utilized this morning. You transmitted a fraudulently signed legal deed across state lines to liquidate a premium heritage asset. You are looking at multiple counts of federal wire fraud, grand theft, and money laundering." Morgan finally found her voice. She stepped backward, her eyes darting frantically toward the heavy front doors. "This is a massive misunderstanding," she stammered, her usual arrogant venom completely replaced by a pathetic, high-pitched panic. "We came up here to help Cliff. He is not well. He is suffering from severe cognitive decline. He does not know what he is doing. You cannot listen to the ramblings of a sick old man. He is incompetent." I walked right past her and took my seat at the head of the table. I did not look at her. I looked at Cameron. The boy I had raised, the son I had tried to protect, was sweating profusely. His chest heaved as he struggled to process the impossible scene in front of him. "How did you do this?" Cameron whispered, his voice cracking as he looked around the room. "How did you get these people here? You live in a moldy apartment. You cannot even afford your own groceries." I leaned forward, resting my hands on the polished oak. I let the silence stretch, letting the sheer weight of his ignorance crush him before I finally spoke. "I did not lose my company, Cameron. I did not go bankrupt when your mother died. I sold my domestic operations and quietly built a $60 million international logistics firm. I move highly sensitive assets across global borders for people who value absolute discretion. I own Vanguard Heritage Acquisitions. I own the shell corporations that purchased the debts on your failing construction projects. And I own this $12 million lodge free and clear." Cameron grabbed the back of a leather chair, his knees visibly buckling. The blood drained completely from his face as the crushing reality of his situation finally breached his thick, arrogant skull. He had spent the last 2 years treating me like a pathetic burden. He had mocked my clothes and laughed at my living conditions. All the while I had been holding the financial keys to his entire existence. When you came to me crying about your failing business, I had a choice to make. I continued keeping my voice dangerously calm and steady. I could have simply written you a check. I could have paid off your massive debts and allowed you to continue living a life of unearned, toxic luxury. But I knew that would only feed the parasite you had become. So I decided to test you. I created the Aspen cabin renovation project to see if you had a single shred of integrity left. I gave you a lifeline. I gave you an opportunity to do honest, hard work and rebuild your reputation. But you could not even do that, I said, gesturing to the stack of audits on the table. You failed the test spectacularly. You did not just fail to manage a business. You actively decided to prey on innocent people. You stole from the Davidsons to pay your country club fees. You stole from the Millers so Morgan could fly on private jets to Milan. And when the walls finally started closing in on your pathetic scheme, you did not come to me for honest help. You decided to forge my signature and steal the very ground your mother is buried in. You crossed the final absolute line. Cameron broke. The arrogant luxury home builder vanished, replaced by a weeping, terrified child. He fell to his knees, gripping the edge of the heavy table. "Dad, please," he sobbed, his voice echoing pathetically in the large room. "You have to understand the pressure I was under. The market shifted. The supply chains dried up. I was drowning. I did not want to steal from anyone. I just needed to keep the company afloat until the next big contract came through. I was doing it for my family." He pointed a trembling finger up at Morgan, who was slowly backing away toward the foyer. "She would not stop spending." He cried out, tears streaming down his flushed face. "Every time I begged her to cut back, she threatened to take my son and leave me. She demanded the jewelry and the vacations and the designer clothes. I was bleeding out and she just kept demanding more. I forged the cemetery deed because she gave me an ultimatum. I did it to keep my family together, Dad. You have to believe me. I am the victim here." Morgan immediately went on the defensive. Her eyes narrowed, and she looked at Cameron with pure, unadulterated disgust. "Do not you dare try to pin your pathetic failures on me," she hissed, her voice dripping with absolute venom. "I had absolutely no idea he was stealing from his clients. I am just a housewife. I do not look at the business ledgers. He told me the company was thriving. He lied to me, just like he lied to all of you. If he is going to prison, that is his own fault. I want a divorce. I want full custody of Leo, and I want nothing to do with this criminal." I watched them tear each other apart. The loyalty they claimed to share was completely obliterated in a matter of seconds. They were two cornered rats willing to chew each other's throats out to survive. I let them scream and point fingers for a full minute before I reached across the table and picked up the thick manila envelope Arthur had delivered. The heavy paper slid smoothly across the polished wood, stopping exactly 1 inch from Cameron's trembling hands. "You are a liar, Cameron," I said, my voice cutting through their pathetic argument like a frozen blade. "But Morgan is a far superior liar. Open the folder." Cameron hesitated, his hands shaking violently. He slowly reached out and flipped the cover open. He stared at the documents, the complex international routing numbers, the offshore banking signatures, the digital conversion receipts. His weeping stopped, completely replaced by a chilling, hollow confusion. "What is this?" he whispered, staring blankly at the pages. "While you were busy stealing from your clients and taking all the federal legal risk, your beloved wife was quietly robbing you," I explained, leaning back in my chair. "Every time you siphoned $100,000 from an escrow account, Morgan intercepted 10% of it. She routed the stolen money through a highly sophisticated network of international cryptocurrency tumblers. She washed the money and deposited it into a hidden offshore account in Dubai, completely under her own name. She knew you were going to get caught, Cameron. She planned on it." Cameron slowly turned his head to look at Morgan. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. Morgan was completely frozen, her eyes wide with a terror so profound she looked physically ill. The arrogant, untouchable princess had finally been dragged out into the harsh, unforgiving light. "Look at the last page in the folder," I commanded. Cameron flipped with numb, mechanical fingers to the glossy sheet of paper at the bottom of the stack. It was the digital flight itinerary. He stared at it for a long, agonizing moment. "She booked a one-way first-class ticket to the Emirates, departing in 48 hours, I said, making sure every single person in the room heard the words clearly. The federal prosecutor, the clients, the auditor, they all stared at Morgan with absolute revulsion. "There is only one passenger on that manifest, Cameron. She was not just abandoning you to face a 20-year prison sentence. She did not buy a ticket for your 5-year-old son. She was going to leave Leo alone in a foreclosed mansion with a father who was about to be dragged away in handcuffs." Cameron dropped the paper. He looked at Morgan, his expression shifting from terror to a deep, horrific realization of his own absolute destruction. He had destroyed his life, betrayed his father, and ruined innocent families, all to please a woman who viewed him as nothing more than a disposable shield. The glossy, heavy cardstock of the printed flight itinerary slid across the polished oak table with a soft whisper. It came to a complete halt exactly half an inch from the trembling tips of Cameron's fingers. The bright overhead lights caught the bold black ink of the departure gate and the destination. Dubai. I sat at the head of the table watching my son's eyes track across the page. His brain was desperately trying to reject the information, processing the sheer mathematical impossibility of the betrayal. He read the passenger name. He read it again. He looked for a secondary booking. He looked for the name of his 5-year-old son. He found nothing but the solitary name of his wife and a first-class seat scheduled to depart in less than 48 hours. The heavy silence in the great room was suffocating. Mr. Davidson and Mrs. Miller sat perfectly still, watching the destruction of the man who had ruined their lives. Mr. Davidson had worked 30 years in a steel mill to save for the lake house Cameron had stolen from him. Mrs. Miller clutched her purse, her knuckles white with justified rage. They had trusted my son to build their family sanctuary, and he had handed their money to a monster. Wallace stood by the monitors, his hands clasped firmly behind his back. Cameron slowly lifted his head. The arrogant posture he had carried into the cabin was entirely gone. His face was a hollow mask of absolute devastation. He looked at Morgan, who was pressed against the mahogany doors, looking like a trapped animal. "You were leaving," he whispered, his voice breaking into a pathetic, dry rasp. "You were going to get on a plane and leave me here." Morgan did not immediately respond. Her eyes darted around the room, calculating the exact trajectory of her survival. She looked at the federal prosecutor and then back at her husband. Her survival instinct overrode any remaining shred of human decency. She did not apologize. She did not offer a tearful excuse. She simply hardened her expression and shifted the blame. "What did you expect me to do, Cameron?" she spat, her voice echoing off the stone walls. "You ruined us. You ran your company into the ground and expected me to just sit there and go down with the ship. You are a failure. You have always been a failure." Cameron stood up, his chair scraping violently against the floor. "I stole for you," he shouted, his face turning a dark, mottled red. "I forged my own father's name to steal my mother's grave because you told me you would take Leo and leave if I did not get the money. I drained those escrow accounts because you refused to stop spending. You bought diamond bracelets while we were defaulting on our mortgage. I am looking at decades in a federal prison, and you were going to sip champagne on a flight to the Emirates. You did not even buy a ticket for our son. You were going to leave Leo alone in that house with me." Morgan laughed, a cold, jagged sound that made the clients sitting at the table flinch in physical disgust. "You think you are a martyr, Cameron," she mocked, crossing her arms and lifting her chin. "You are just a coward who got caught. I was securing my own future because you were entirely incapable of providing one. I took that money to protect myself from your colossal stupidity. You think I wanted to be tied to a bankrupt contractor facing federal indictments. You dug this grave completely by yourself. Do not you dare try to pull me into it." She turned away from her husband and looked directly at Thomas Vance, the federal prosecutor. She smoothed the front of her expensive coat and adopted a posture of victimhood. She was completely delusional, attempting to manipulate a room full of people who had just spent 4 hours tracking her digital crimes. "I am completely innocent in this," she stated, her voice dripping with fabricated sincerity. "I had absolutely no idea he was stealing from his clients. He managed all the finances. He kept me completely in the dark. I only opened that account in Dubai because I noticed money missing, and I wanted to put something away to protect my child from his father's erratic behavior. I am a victim of financial abuse." Cameron slammed his fists onto the oak table, the sudden violence making the heavy wood shudder. "You are a liar," he screamed, his voice completely devoid of any remaining sanity. "You orchestrated the entire thing. You told me which accounts to drain. You set up the vendors that we funneled the cash through. You told me we could walk in here tonight and declare my father mentally incompetent so we could steal this lodge. You planned all of it. Tell them, Morgan. Tell the federal prosecutor how you told me to forge the cemetery deed. Tell him how you wanted to lock my dad in a state-run asylum." I sat perfectly still, watching the two cannibals devour each other in the center of the room. This was the absolute culmination of their toxic existence. They had built a marriage on vanity and greed, and the absolute second the foundation cracked, they turned their teeth on each other. There was no loyalty. There was no love. There was only a desperate feral scramble to find a shield. Morgan was willing to send Cameron to prison for the rest of his life to save her own skin, and Cameron was willing to drag the mother of his child down into the dirt with him. They were executing my justice for me. They were burning their own lives to ash right in front of my eyes. Morgan pointed a trembling, manicured finger at her husband. "You are hysterical," she yelled, her voice reaching a shrill, unbearable pitch. "You are trying to deflect because you know you are guilty. You signed those documents. Your name is on the Apex construction charter. Your name is on the fraudulent vendor payouts. I am just your wife. I never signed a single thing. You cannot prove I had any knowledge of your pathetic little schemes. I am calling my lawyer, and I am leaving this cabin right now." She reached for the heavy brass handles of the double doors, entirely intent on walking out into the blizzard and vanishing into the night. She honestly believed her arrogance could simply override a federal investigation. She believed she could talk her way out of a room full of absolute irrefutable evidence. She pulled the handle, but the door did not budge. Wallace had locked it the second they stepped inside. Morgan rattled the brass hardware, a sudden spike of genuine panic finally breaking through her cold facade. Thomas Vance stood up. The heavy scrape of the prosecutor's wooden chair against the stone floor echoed like a gunshot. The sound instantly silenced the screaming match. Cameron froze, his hands still resting on the table. Morgan turned away from the locked doors, her chest heaving as she stared at the man in the charcoal suit. The chaotic feral energy in the room was completely extinguished, replaced by the heavy, crushing weight of absolute federal authority. "Take a seat," Mrs. Bennett Vance instructed, his voice carrying no emotion, no anger, and absolutely no room for negotiation. "You are not calling a lawyer, and you are certainly not leaving this mountain." Morgan opened her mouth to argue, to project her fabricated victimhood one more time, but Vance simply raised a single hand. He reached down and picked up the thick dossier of intercepted routing numbers and decryption keys that Arthur had provided. He dropped the heavy stack of papers right next to the flight itinerary. The sudden sharp slap of the documents hitting the wood made Cameron physically flinch. "We do not need your signature on a construction charter to prove your involvement," Mrs. Bennett Vance said, looking directly into her panicked eyes. "We have the decrypted metadata from your personal laptop. We have the IP logs proving you personally executed the transfers from the Apex shell accounts into the international cryptocurrency tumblers. We have the recorded digital footprints of you manually bypassing domestic tax codes to park those stolen funds in Dubai. You did not just know about the embezzlement. You were the primary architect of the money laundering operation." Vance turned his gaze to Cameron, who was staring at the table looking like a man standing on the gallows, waiting for the lever to be pulled. And Mr. Bennett Vance continued, his voice completely devoid of pity. "We have the physical copies of the forged notary stamps you used to liquidate the cemetery plot. We have the complete financial roadmap of every single dollar you stole from the people sitting in this room. Your business is seized. Your accounts are permanently frozen. Your assets are currently being liquidated by the federal government to provide restitution to your victims." The legal trap had snapped completely shut. There were no more shadows for them to hide in. There were no more lies they could spin to shift the blame. They had walked into my home expecting to conquer a weak old man, and instead they had marched directly into a federal execution chamber. I looked at Cameron and Morgan, watching the last remaining shreds of their arrogant entitlement dissolve into absolute ruin. They had crossed the line to steal my past, and now they had permanently lost their future. The sharp metallic click of steel handcuffs echoed loudly against the vaulted timber ceilings of the Aspen cabin. The sound was incredibly precise and entirely final. 2 federal agents stepped out from the shadowed hallway leading to the guest suites, where Thomas Vance had positioned them an hour before the confrontation began. They moved with a synchronized, heavy purpose that instantly sucked the remaining oxygen from the great room. They did not shout. They did not need to. The sheer, overwhelming reality of their presence paralyzed the space. Cameron did not fight. The boy I had raised, the man who had stolen millions, simply went limp. His knees finally buckled completely, giving way beneath the crushing weight of his own monumental failures. An agent caught him by the shoulder, hauling him upright and twisting his wrists behind his back. The second click of the cuffs locking into place sounded like a vault door slamming shut on his future. He stared at the floor, his chest heaving with dry, hollow sobs. He looked exactly like the terrified teenager who had wrecked my truck 20 years ago, expecting me to fix the disaster. But I was not fixing this. I was the architect of his reckoning. Morgan, however, reacted like a cornered feral animal. The absolute shock on her face mutated instantly into a wild, frenzied panic. She shoved her heavy leather chair backward. The wooden legs screeched violently across the stone tiles, making the defrauded clients at the table flinch. She did not look at her husband. She did not look at the federal prosecutor. She spun on her designer stilettos and bolted toward the foyer. She was running purely on adrenaline and toxic entitlement, completely convinced that she could simply outrun a federal indictment if she could just reach the driver's seat of her car. "Stop right there," Vance ordered, his voice calm but layered with absolute authority. Morgan ignored him. She sprinted across the foyer, her breathing ragged and loud. She slammed her hands against the massive oak and glass front doors, pushing them open into the freezing mountain blizzard. She took 2 steps onto the snow-covered stone porch and froze completely dead in her tracks. I walked slowly from the head of the dining table, following the trail of mud her luggage had left on my floors. I stopped right behind her, looking out through the driving snow. The driveway was no longer empty. The violent wind whipped around the heavy yellow rotating lights of an industrial tow truck parked directly in front of my cabin steps. A man in a thick, insulated canvas jacket was operating a hydraulic winch. The thick steel cables were already hooked securely beneath the chassis of Morgan's leased luxury sports utility vehicle. The massive truck groaned as the winch engaged, dragging her pristine status symbol through the dirty slush and hoisting it onto the flatbed. Morgan stood on the porch, shivering in the freezing air, her arms wrapping defensively around her own chest. "What are they doing?" she whispered, her voice trembling as the reality of the scene shattered her mind. "That is my car. You cannot take my car." She turned back to look at me, her eyes wide and bloodshot. "Tell them to stop, Cliff. You have money. Pay them off. Tell them to drop the car." I stepped out onto the cold stone, letting the freezing wind hit my face. I did not raise my voice. I spoke with a quiet, devastating clarity that sliced right through the howling blizzard. "They are not taking your car, Morgan. They are taking my car." She stared at me, her jaw trembling as the snow caught in her hair. "What are you talking about?" I folded my arms across my chest, watching the tow truck secure the heavy chains. When my investigators uncovered the sheer volume of debt you and Cameron had accumulated, I knew a simple federal arrest would leave too many loose ends. You are a highly manipulative woman, Morgan. You would have found a way to hire a sleazy defense attorney using a secondary line of credit. You would have leveraged a vehicle or a secondary property to post bail. I needed to ensure that every single exit was permanently sealed. So I instructed Vanguard Heritage to buy your debt. Morgan stopped shivering. She simply stared at me, her mind struggling to process the impossible scope of what I was saying. I bought the primary mortgage on your mansion, I explained slowly, making sure she understood every single word. I bought the secondary lines of credit you opened to furnish the house. I bought the outstanding balances on your platinum credit cards. And 3 days ago, I bought the lease agreement for that very vehicle they are currently hauling away. I am the Bank Morgan. I am the holding company. I am the ultimate creditor for every single dime you owe in this world. And as of this morning, you are in complete and total default. She opened her mouth, but the words died in her throat. The arrogant, untouchable woman who had demanded I sign away my dead wife's grave was completely gone. She was entirely stripped of her armor. She had nothing. Her money was frozen. Her car was seized. Her house was actively being foreclosed upon by the very man she had tried to lock in a psychiatric ward. You own nothing, I told her, the cold air turning my breath into white mist. You are a fugitive with no assets, no allies, and absolutely nowhere left to run. The 2 federal agents stepped out onto the porch behind us. One of them reached out and grabbed Morgan's arm, pulling her firmly back into the foyer. She did not fight them. The fight had been completely drained from her veins. The second agent secured her wrists behind her back, the cold steel clicking shut over the sleeves of her expensive cashmere coat. She looked down at the muddy floor, her shoulders completely collapsed. They marched her back into the great room where Cameron was waiting near the dining table. The defrauded clients watched in heavy, satisfying silence as the couple who had destroyed their lives were paraded in front of them in chains. Mr. Davidson, the steelworker, who had lost his life savings, stood up from his chair. He did not say a word to Cameron. He simply looked at him with a profound, heavy disgust and turned his back. That single movement carried more weight than any shouted insult or curse. It was the ultimate dismissal of a worthless man. The agents grabbed Cameron and Morgan by the arms, guiding them toward the heavy front doors. They walked clumsily, their balance compromised by the handcuffs and the sheer terror of their impending reality. As they reached the center of the foyer, Cameron stopped and dug his heels into the hardwood floor. The agent yanked his arm, but Cameron violently twisted his body around to face me. His face was streaked with tears and mucus. He looked absolutely pathetic, a broken shell of a man begging for a miracle he did not deserve. "Dad," he cried out, his voice cracking into a high, desperate pitch. "Dad, please do not do this. You have the money. You have the power. You can stop this. You can pay them off. You can hire the lawyers. Please, Dad, I am your son. I am your only son." I stood motionless by the stone fireplace, watching him weep. I felt a strange, hollow ache in my chest, but it was not sympathy. It was the final agonizing process of mourning a child who had died a very long time ago. The man standing in front of me was a stranger. Think about Leo. Cameron begged, dropping to his knees and forcing the federal agents to hold him up by his armpits. Think about your grandson. If we go to prison, he goes into the foster system. You cannot let them take him. You cannot abandon family like this. I will do anything. I will work in your warehouses. I will scrub the floors. Just please bail us out. Please do not let them lock us in a cage. I stepped closer to him, looking down into his desperate, pleading eyes. I thought about Leo. I thought about the sweet, innocent 5-year-old boy who was currently slept in a massive, empty house, completely unaware of the storm his parents had brought down upon him. "Leo is already safe," I told Cameron, my voice dropping to a low, steady rumble. "While you were driving up this mountain to steal my home, my legal team executed an emergency ex parte custody order. My private security detail picked Leo up from your empty house exactly 2 hours ago. He is currently asleep in a secure hotel suite in Denver, surrounded by people who will actually protect him. You will never use that child as a bargaining chip against me ever again. He is permanently out of your reach." Cameron's eyes widened in absolute shock. The final piece of leverage he thought he possessed had been quietly removed from the board. He sagged against the agents the last remaining ounce of fight, completely leaving his body. He hung his head, weeping openly and loudly into the collar of his coat. "Take them away," Vance ordered, stepping out from the great room and gesturing toward the open doors. The agents hauled Cameron back to his feet, dragging him out onto the freezing porch. Morgan stumbled behind him, keeping her head down, refusing to look at me or the tow truck, currently pulling away with her seized vehicle. As Cameron crossed the threshold out into the howling mountain blizzard, he turned his head over his shoulder for one final, desperate plea. His eyes were wide and red, begging for a single shred of mercy from the father he had tried to destroy. "Dad, please," he sobbed. "What are we supposed to do? Where are we supposed to go?" I stood in the warmth of my foyer, looking at the two miserable parasites shivering in the snow. I remembered the rain pouring down on my shoulders as Morgan slammed the door of their mansion in my face. I remembered the absolute coldness in her voice when she told me my usefulness had expired. I did not feel angry anymore. I only felt the pure, clean weight of justice settling over the mountain. I looked directly into my son's weeping eyes and delivered the final, absolute blow. "Find a shelter that takes felons." I reached out and grabbed the heavy brass handles of the double oak doors. I pulled them shut with a smooth, solid motion, sealing the freezing wind and the pathetic sobbing out of my home. The heavy deadbolt clicked into place, locking the world away. I turned back toward the great room where Wallace was quietly packing up the encrypted tablets. The fire crackled warmly in the hearth, pushing the last remaining shadows out of the cabin. The rot had been excised. The ghost was gone. The ledger was finally perfectly balanced. The town car glided to a smooth halt in front of the massive wrought iron gates of the estate, where Cameron and Morgan had desperately tried to maintain their fragile illusion of wealth. The sprawling mansion looked hollow and gray against the stark winter sky. I stepped out onto the cold concrete and adjusted my coat, feeling the heavy weight of the emergency custody order tucked securely inside my breast pocket. My movement was efficient and silent as I walked past the overgrown hedges and the empty, dry fountain that had once been a centerpiece of their performative lifestyle. The front door was unlocked, a final sign of the frantic chaos that had consumed the household since the federal agents had descended on the Aspen Lodge. I pushed the door open and stepped into the grand foyer. It was completely silent. The life had been sucked out of the space, leaving only the scent of stale perfume and abandonment. A young nanny sat on the edge of a velvet armchair in the corner, her eyes wide with shock as she clutched a tablet. She looked like a girl who had been watching the world collapse through a series of increasingly frantic and incoherent text messages. When she saw me standing in the doorway, she did not scream. She simply exhaled a breath of profound relief. "Mr. Bennett," she whispered, looking at me as if I were a ghost. "I have been calling and calling, but no one is answering. The police are all over the property records, and the banks are here to take everything. What is happening to Leo?" I did not offer hollow reassurances. I walked directly toward the stairs, my boots clicking sharply on the marble. "I am here for Leo," I said, my voice steady and cold. "I have the legal authority to remove him from these premises immediately." "Where is he?" The nanny stood up, her hands shaking as she pointed toward the nursery upstairs. "He is sleeping," she said softly. "He has been crying for hours because he does not understand why his parents left and never came back." I climbed the staircase without another word. Each step felt like a victory over the toxic wreckage Morgan had left behind. I reached the nursery and opened the door softly. The room was decorated in an aggressive, opulent style that felt entirely wrong for a 5-year-old boy. Leo was curled up in a massive, oversized bed, his small frame looking fragile and lost, amidst the sea of expensive linens. His breathing was heavy and ragged, a sign of the deep distress he had endured in the absence of any real adult guidance. I sat on the edge of the mattress and brushed a stray lock of hair from his forehead. He stirred but did not wake. I lifted him carefully, feeling the familiar weight of my grandson against my chest. He was the only thing in this entire ruined house that possessed any true value. He was the only piece of my bloodline that had not been tainted by the insatiable greed of his parents. I carried him down the stairs and out into the biting cold of the afternoon. The nanny followed me holding a small backpack filled with his meager belongings. She watched with tears in her eyes as I tucked him into the back seat of the town car and buckled his seatbelt. He did not wake even when the engine roared to life. He was finally in a place where he would be protected from the storm. I stood on the sidewalk for one final moment, watching the estate. Two men in dark suits carrying heavy metal padlocks and legal notices were walking up the driveway. They were representatives of the bank arriving to secure the asset. They did not notice me as they moved toward the front door, their faces set in the bored expression of people doing a mundane job. They were there to lock the doors and board the windows permanently, ending the farce that had been the Bennett household. I watched as they placed the first padlock on the wrought iron gate. It clicked shut with a sharp metallic sound that was the final punctuation mark on a chapter of my life I had spent too long trying to edit. I got into the car and closed the door, cutting off the sight of the mansion forever. I had rescued the innocent and left the guilty to the slow-grinding machinery of federal justice. The car pulled away, and I did not look back. Morning sunlight broke over the jagged, snow-capped Aspen peaks with a fierce, blinding clarity. The brutal blizzard that had raged through the night was completely gone, leaving behind a pristine, silent world buried under 3 feet of pure white powder. The thick beams of golden light flooded through the massive floor-to-ceiling windows of the great room, chasing away the last remaining shadows of the long, terrible night. The chaotic, toxic noise of Cameron and Morgan screaming at each other, throwing wild accusations and begging for unearned salvation, had been entirely absorbed by the thick timber walls. In its place, there was only the quiet, immovable dignity of the mountains and the soft, soothing crackle of the roaring fire in the stone hearth. It was the sound of a natural order finally restoring itself after a long, agonizing sickness. I sat at the head of the heavy live-edge dining table, resting my hands on the warm, polished wood. I was not looking at the empty driveway where the tow truck had dragged away the last symbol of my son's arrogance. I was looking directly at the thick, plush rug in front of the fireplace. Little Leo was sitting cross-legged in his warm flannel pajamas, playing happily with a set of intricately carved wooden blocks. He was humming a quiet, cheerful tune, completely oblivious to the absolute destruction that had rained down upon his parents' lives just 12 hours prior. He did not know that his mother and father were currently waking up in cold, concrete federal holding cells. He did not know that the massive, opulent mansion he used to live in was now chained shut with heavy metal padlocks. He only knew that he was safe, warm, and loved. Looking at his small, innocent face, I felt the last lingering traces of guilt completely wash out of my chest. I had spent years watching Cameron and Morgan twist this beautiful child into an accessory for their toxic lifestyle. They had paraded him around country clubs and high society galas, treating him like a designer handbag rather than a living, breathing boy. They would have eventually poisoned his soul, teaching him to value greed over integrity and manipulation over honest, hard work. I had excised them from his life just as surgically as a doctor removing a malignant tumor. It was a brutal, agonizing process, but it was absolutely necessary for the host to survive. Leo was my blood, and I was going to ensure that he grew up understanding the true weight of a dollar and the absolute pricelessness of a clear conscience. The soft sound of footsteps against the reclaimed hardwood floors pulled my attention away from the fire. Wallace walked into the great room looking remarkably rested, despite having spent the entire night coordinating with federal prosecutors and international banking liaisons. He carried a single, thick, leather-bound folio in his hands. He did not say a word as he approached the table. He simply placed the heavy document down on the oak surface right where the federal indictments had rested the night before. He opened the cover, revealing a stack of crisp legal pages printed on thick, heavy stock paper. This was the final masterstroke. It was not a weapon of destruction, but an impenetrable shield of protection. I leaned forward and began to read the meticulously drafted clauses. It was a comprehensive blind trust, completely liquidating the international logistics empire I had spent the last decade building from the shadows. $60 million in clean, untraceable global assets were being permanently locked behind a fortress of legal iron. The beneficiary was Leo. The funds were strictly allocated for his education, his medical care, and his future foundation. He would not receive a massive lump sum on his 18th birthday to squander on sports cars and reckless investments. The money would be dispersed in measured, calculated stages, contingent upon his completion of higher education and his demonstrated ability to maintain honest, steady employment. But the most vital paragraphs were buried deep in the heart of the document. I read the specific exclusionary clauses twice, savoring the absolute unyielding finality of the language. There was an airtight, impenetrable barrier permanently separating Cameron and Morgan from this wealth. They were legally barred from ever accessing a single cent of the trust. They could not petition the Board of Trustees for living expenses. They could not request emergency loans for legal defense fees. They could not use Leo as a financial hostage to siphon money from the estate. If they ever attempted to challenge the trust in a court of law, the document explicitly instructed the administrators to dedicate unlimited financial resources to burying them in retaliatory litigation. They had spent years viewing me as a pathetic resource to be drained, and now they were permanently exiled to a barren desert of their own making. I reached into my breast pocket and pulled out my heavy gold fountain pen. The metal felt cool and solid in my grip. I looked at the bottom of the final page where a single black line waited for my authorization. I did not hesitate. I did not feel a single tremor in my hand. I pressed the gold nib against the thick paper and signed my name with slow, deliberate strokes. The dark ink soaked into the page, cementing the contract. The deed was done. The vast international fortune I had built in absolute silence was now officially out of my hands and secured for the next generation. I placed the cap back on the pen and slid the folio across the table toward Wallace. He nodded silently, snapping the leather cover shut and walking away to secure the future. I pushed my chair back from the table and stood up. The heavy burdens of deception, manipulation, and silent endurance that had weighed on my shoulders for 2 agonizing years were completely gone. I felt lighter than I had in decades. I walked slowly across the room toward the roaring stone fireplace. Leo looked up from his wooden blocks, his bright blue eyes reflecting the dancing orange flames. He smiled a pure, uncorrupted expression of absolute joy and held up a small carved wooden bear for me to see. I sat down on the plush rug next to him, feeling the wonderful radiating heat of the fire sink into my bones. I smiled back at my grandson, pulling him into a warm, secure embrace. Outside the massive windows, the sun continued to rise over the Aspen Mountains, bathing the frozen world in a brilliant, blinding light. The storm was finally over. The natural order had been fully restored, and the boundaries protecting our peace would never be broken again. The profound lesson embedded within this narrative is that genuine love requires the courage to enforce absolute boundaries. When a patriarch sacrifices unconditionally, without demanding respect, he inadvertently cultivates entitlement and greed within his lineage. True protection does not mean shielding family members from the consequences of their toxic actions. It means having the formidable strength to sever the rot before it infects the innocent. By refusing to fund his son's arrogance and meticulously securing his grandson's future, the protagonist demonstrates that establishing an unyielding foundation of accountability is the ultimate act of generational salvation and enduring love. If you resonated with this story of reclaimed dignity and absolute justice, Please leave a comment sharing your thoughts and subscribe to the channel for more powerful narratives.